shift on Thursdays at Kennedy Institute, Boston, and I got off the T and walked here. So I thought it was
I used to do that. Have a football match. Walk around.
somebody. I think you guys might have to be sitting on the floor today.
Okay.
Do you think we have to sit?
I think so. I think Ryan is already down there.
Yeah.
I have to tweet. Want to sit next to each other? Or I don't have to.
What?
But yeah.
We sit up here?
I am not going to sit down there. No.
I'm gonna sit. I'm gonna leave.
Oh wait, there's someone right here.
I've done it.
Is this yours?
Alright. Oh wait,
So
is
move
this
it.
DJ's too?
You know what?
Can I sit
Bro?
in between or okay?
Okay, bro.
Good, how are you, DJ? Yeah, that would be nice. Yeah, there'll be a ton of
I
people
have
there.
to write an 8-page paper.
It's crazy. How many people are there?
I hear not as many are coming.
At least.
I don't blame them.
I don't know, probably like, we have like 8 people.
I don't know.
Ananya and Mackenzie.
I can't even keep track. There's a good amount.
Right,
I'll move that way. Yeah, it should be like
5:59. Are you
Virginia. She's coming up.
Who's like my dude?
What?
You're missing the point of it.
Who's like,
Literally every single one I've ever met to.
Biggest message so I can start a group chat with one person less.
Are you looking at us?
Yes.
Same.
I'm having an existential crisis.
Because you declared and now you're like, fuck. My crisis is that I don't know what I'm going to do with my life.
I mean, yeah, that's which is kind of why.
The thing is, I'm limited because I'm dumb. And I can't do math. Or science.
Yeah, I can't do math either. I mean, I'm so. What is the opposite of thriving?
I'm taking CS. I'm taking a CS class next week. I'm taking CS1.
CS1? What is that?
CS1 maybe. It's for if you have no experience at all.
Why not CS50?
Because CS50 is hard. CS1 is for like babies. Yeah, it's like teach CS to a fifth grader.
I'm doing CS50 now.
I can't do that.
Interesting. Do you like it?
I actually do. I have not found what people say good about it to be true.
How are you?
I think it's personal, like preference. I also I enjoy. I didn't really have any experience. Like I did it for I did APCS in high school, which was a semester my senior year. So like literally I've only had a couple months. Yeah, but I like the problem solving aspect of it. So I guess I
Are
kind
you
of
considering CS?
yeah I might I'm kind of between CS and econ. I'm just not really sure.
Talk to Ryan Davis. And Sam. Would you get that? Because I think she's CS, right?
Who is?
Sam on.
Okay. Wait, where is she right now?
Yeah.
Say when
I know she's
She's
CS.
doing like
CA, CS, does she have a section?
punched it? Okay. Got it.
My
Fun stuff.
meeting after this got canceled.
apparently.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I basically.
Good afternoon and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Blake Barclay and I'm a freshman studying economics and religion at the college. And I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located at the Park side and at the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join us in the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag Post-Midterms Forum, which is also listed in your program. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, Michael Glassner, Maria Teresa Kumar via Skype, Beth Myers, Stephanie Schriock, Rick Klein, and Institute of Politics Senior Fellow Dan Balls.
Thank you. I'm here to do the brief introductions. We have a chair awaiting Stephanie Schriock. I'm Dan Baltz. I'm a senior fellow here at the IOP this year. I also work at the Washington Post where I cover politics. And I want to thank all of you for coming out on what looks like could be a lousy night, at least once we finish up. We've had a bit of a chaotic day because of weather in Washington and New York. We lost Alex Burns, who was going to be part of the group, but his flight got canceled. As you heard, Teresa Kumar will be with us by Skype, but she couldn't make it. Amy Dacey is filling in, and Stephanie Schriock is en route from the airport. So we've got a great group tonight. We had an election 10 days ago, 9 days ago, and some people thought they knew what happened that night. CNN this week decided people didn't really know what happened, and so they staged a 3-hour election night do-over where they literally were talking about votes being counted and races being decided. So tonight, you're going to find out what really happened. We're going to talk a little bit about what took place last week, but then look ahead to the implications of what this very interesting midterm may hold for the future. I'm going to turn it over to Rick Klein. He's the political director at ABC with the Post, our polling partner. We call it the Post ABC poll. He calls it the ABC Post poll. Rick is, as I say, he's the political director. He oversees their operation on all things politics and other matters. He has roots here. He was a Boston Globe reporter before he went to ABC in 2007. So without further ado, Rick, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the IOP for hosting this. It has been a bit of a travel adventure for a lot of us today, so we appreciate you coming out here pre-snow. As discussed, joining me right here is Beth Myers, who was a longtime advisor to Mitt Romney during a couple of presidential campaigns and working right here in Massachusetts when he was governor, and also an former IOP fellow.
Yes.
All right. Michael Glassner, a senior advisor, a top advisor to Donald Trump's re-election campaign. Amy Dacey, who's a fellow here at the IOP, former CEO of the DNC, as well as a head of Emily's List. Empty chair that will be filled very shortly by Stephanie Schriock, we hope. And on Skype behind us is Maria Teresa Kumar from Voto Latino. Hi. So, as Dan mentioned, some history was made just about 9 days ago or so. 115 million Americans voted, almost half of the voting eligible population, the biggest voter turnout in a century. The next day, the president came out and declared it very close to complete victory. My question, Michael Glassner, to put you on the spot, really? Really, very close to complete victory. As you know, the Republicans lost close to 40 House seats when it's all said and done. Governor's races in places including Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, places that were key to your election campaign last time. Outlook a little better in the Senate, but total complete victory?
Well, today in all days, I do not speak for the president, so he speaks for himself. So and I don't make a habit either of interpreting publicly what he says. So I can say that, having been through these election cycles a lot of times, is that what may seem apparent the day after the election is not necessarily apparent after a period of time passes. And I think that's true in many election cycles. It's true in this one, particularly where there was so many that were the outcome was unclear, and I think that's also of a historic proportion that happened this time, is that it was unclear how many had been won or lost. I think, one thing is important to view this from a historical perspective. The number of seats lost by a party in that controls the executive branch was, I think, in line more or less with what has happened historically, and the retention of the Senate, I think, was very powerful and important. And also, our focus, particularly in the last 2 weeks, was on those very competitive Senate races. We went to 11 states in 6 days, and 9 of those Senate races that we campaigned for were successful. So, I think it's all, if you've watched closely what the president's proclamations over a period of time is, that he is relentlessly optimistic, and what you can, observers or listeners can decide whether that's true or not true, what he says, and that's open to interpretation. But I'm not surprised by what he said. So,
Amy, Dacey, I'd like your take on what it means for the Democratic Party, and your interpretation also of what it means for the 2020 map. If there's any lessons you can draw out of the results last week that tell you about what America is going to look like the next time we elect a president.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will say this. The president didn't have a no-hitter on election night. He didn't have one the next day either. I mean, there was significant change, and to say that a lot wouldn't be, I think, accurate in this. We've seen a lot change. I will give the not winning the Senate a map we never really should have. It was incredibly difficult to start out with. I don't think our expectations were we were going to win that back. Is a challenge for us, especially when you look at judicial nominations, cabinet positions, and also losing 3 great public servants on the Democratic Party side, with these senators. I will say, though, that picking up, flipping Senate seats in Arizona and Nevada has a significant impact on the 2020 election. I also think, to your point, Rick, talking about those governor's races in key states in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, which the president himself and his team credits for a lot of the reason that he won in 2016. I would rather have Democrats sitting in those offices there. And the bottom line is winning back the House was significant, not only for a public policy position or having balanced power in government, but we won in a lot of different districts where we can organize now, where we have Democratic House members. And I think one of the untold stories too is all the significant chambers we were able to flip in the state legislatures. 8 chambers flip, over 350, seats won. That will have a significant impact when you're building a national campaign. I don't underestimate how difficult it will be to run against Donald Trump, but I think these victories and winning in some of these places are going to have an impact on the map in 2020. It's a different map.
What do you think, Beth? How is the map different as you analyze these results 9-10 days later? There's some intriguing commentary out in the last couple of days suggesting that Texas is now a swing state, a battleground state. Maybe Ohio is off the map for Democrats. That's a red state. Are things substantially different, do you think, as a result of what we learned last week?
Look, I think that midterm races are always important, and they always matter, and it's always important to vote. That being said, we have 24 long months between now and the election in 2020, and a lot can happen. Do I think Texas is a toss-up state? Absolutely not. Certainly not in 2020. Although Beto O'Rourke was an interesting candidate, Texas is still pretty solid red, particularly in a presidential year. And I'm with Michael. This was, you always see the historic norm happen, or you usually do. You didn't in George W. Bush in 2002 broke that mold, but going to historic norms, this race was solidly in the middle of that. We had a divergent election where the Republicans kept the Senate and lost the House. The Republicans were also at an historic high number of governors, and there was an almost inevitable swing back. So I think it's an important part of the 2020 map, but I don't read too much into it as far as being impactful on the presidential race.
Maria Teresa Kumar, to bring you into the conversation via Skype. You wrote a couple days ago that if 1992 was the year of the woman, 2018 will go down in history as the year of the black and brown women. And we saw the pictures this week of freshman orientation, and certainly this is a freshman class of House members that doesn't look like anyone in history. What's the importance of that, both for day-to-day operations of Congress, to have these diverse voices, and for what the future holds for politics in America?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me in through Skype. I wish I was there. I'm a Teresa alum, so nice to see you. It's a little bit daunting to see a big screen, so hi. But there's a couple of things. I think that when we actually start looking at what the electoral map looks like in 2020, there's 2 things that we should really be thinking about. First of all, 1 in 6 voters were new voters. They were first-time voters. We have never seen a wave of that come of new blood actually not only running for office, but also basically participating in Congress, especially in a midterm. This was the highest midterm participation in over 100 years. That says that people are paying attention, and young people are paying attention. The reason that is valuable is that when you start looking at the electoral map for 2020, for the very first time, we're going to have 12 million more young voters than baby boomers. We just came out with a survey with Change Research where we basically surveyed over 1,500 millennial voters in 5 states, and for the very first time, they said that they were going to vote, and 94% of them said that they were going to vote in every single election. So it is incumbent upon both parties to basically start putting points on the wall to make sure that they are not only paying attention, but trying to differentiate themselves from each other. And if there is a way to make sure that there is a wave and a change of that electoral base, the Democrats they can't basically dig deep into just investigations of the Republican Party. What they're really going to have to do is also basically demonstrate how they are different from the Republican Party, how they are different from the Trumpism, and how they can actually deliver policies that make them change. And that is where we're going to see, I think, a shift. When folks say that Texas is not in play, I encourage folks to think about the fact that Pete Sessions, 11-term incumbent, who was part of the Republican leadership, just lost. His district had 11% Latino representation. By 2020, it's going to be 17%. By 2024, it's going to be 24%. I would encourage folks to think of Texas much more akin to what California was under Pete Wilson, where all of a sudden Pete Wilson was the original architect of really difficult anti-immigration laws that all of a sudden awoke this sleeping giant that people kept saying wasn't going to be possible in California. And that's currently what's happening in Texas, in Arizona, and in Nevada.
Michael Glassner, to turn that to you, exit polls showed that 2 out of 3 new voters, first-time voters, voted for Democrats. There was this big surge in Latino participation, primarily benefiting Democrats, upticks in black voter participation, this wave of women candidates. When you take all of that information and you look at the results in the House, whether it's outside Houston and outside Dallas or across the country, what does it do differently for your map and your calculations going to 2020? What did you learn last week that you say, this is something that Donald Trump should do differently than we anticipated?
I wouldn't say that there were different outcomes in different states based on different candidacies and campaigns in this case. So the Trump phenomenon in 2016, I think, was due to Trump himself being on the ticket, which wasn't the case this time. So I also wouldn't reading historical trends into the outcomes of elections that Trump is participating in, I think is folly, because he's ran his first campaign on such a different model. Presidency has been totally different than any other. His re-election campaign will be the same. So it is important who the governors are, I think, but I also think that there's a large block of people who are Trump voters. These are the people that we identified. I started with the campaign when he announced in 2015. I've been there continuously. So I've been very closely monitoring this Trump movement, if you will. And we identified, my theory very early on, which I think largely turned out to be true in the primaries and the general election in 2016, is that the pollsters were asking the wrong people the wrong questions. And there was a large mass of people who did not participate in past elections, or who were not motivated by past politicians, or had been turned off by the system and were turned out by other politicians. So I think that's still the case. The Trump phenomenon is unique to him being on the ticket. So the Democrats were successful in many states that were important to us in 2016. I don't know how much that matters to that block of voters that have been very consistently stuck with him. And
you don't think it changes anything? Is there any lessons from last week that you think, well, this is something we should work into our travel schedule, or
well,
we're going to be
I think
competitive?
it's always harder to run. For a non-politician to run, it was much easier to take positions because you weren't necessarily anchored to your past, pronouncements. Now there's a whole body of policies and statements and tweets, that you're now going to be held accountable for the re-election. So I think that that body of work probably makes more of a difference than what changes took place in the swing states.
Amy, what do you see as the Democrats' challenge now before we get to the 2020 sweepstakes? We'll talk a bit about the presidential race that we're expecting on the Democratic side, but Democrats are going to be committee chairman soon. There's a fight that we're anticipating in the next week or two over the House Speaker. would it be a bad signal if Nancy Pelosi isn't the House Speaker in the aftermath? And what do Democrats have to watch out for in the new year?
Yeah, I think with the leadership race, I think what's most important is whoever is running or is talking about running has to embrace these new members and have a two-way conversation with them. I think they have to be included in, how they decide about what the priorities of the caucus are. And I think that's really important, especially for people who, these new members coming in who ran on that voice and wanting to see some new faces and new ideas in Congress. So I think that's really important. Whether or not it's a really contested leadership race or not, I think that's a big part that they have to feel included. And if they can accomplish that during the process, I think we'll be better off kind of going forward with that. I do think that there's always a challenge when you have a running against an incumbent. I was on the 2004 campaign, and it's difficult, especially when you have a primary, that you have an incumbent that's able to solely put out their message, talk about what they're doing. I think we're going to have a robust primary. In a lot of ways, I think that's good. I think we have a wealth of candidates that can run and really speak to why they are different than President Trump and the values that he's putting forward and the policies that he's embracing. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we have strong party leaders who are holding the current administration responsible and talking about the missteps and what the challenges are. I think those are things that are always a challenge when your party is the one that's having a primary and kind of moving forward. But, for just to follow up on, Trump wasn't on the ballot, but, there's a lot of these, and to use his word, there's a lot of campaigns that he embraced that didn't win on the House side. So I think that it's also going back, and as Democrats, we can't run the campaign we ran in 2008. We can't run the campaign we did in 2016. This is a new map, which will have, new candidates that are running, and we have to make sure that we're running the race that we're in and not trying to race a one that we are already in.
And Stephanie
Schriock
joins us. Thank you for coming straight from the airport. We appreciate that.
Yes.
So
a little snow in Washington, D.C., and you know what happens. It's not Massachusetts, everybody.
I do. Well, Stephanie, let's bring into the conversation right away and follow up a bit on the point we were talking about with Amy. What is, to your mind, the main challenge and the opportunity for Democrats as they take over one chamber of Congress and as they gear up for 2020?
First off, we're just so happy to have one chamber right now. This
Michael's
is fantastic. Some of us up here are really, really happy about this. And so as the Democratic majority comes into the United States House of Representatives and gets organized, they recognize that what the vast majority of these candidates won on was really a conversation about access to health care. I mean, I look at the 23 and maybe at 8 o'clock tonight, the 24 women who picked up seats on the Democratic side that Emily's List supported for the majority. Every one of those really, really focused on the issues facing their districts, and it was health care and access to health care and ensuring that people with pre-existing conditions were not going to lose their health insurance. And this, everywhere you went, that was a big part of this conversation, as well as issues of good jobs and education and other things like that. So they're going to come in and they're going to feel the Democratic base wanting to do, and there should be oversight over what's going on with the Trump administration. That obviously will be something that is important not only to this country, but also to what happens in 2020. But they cannot lose sight about this issue of health care and trying to find solutions.
Beth Myers, where do you view the Republican Congress in this? What's the challenge for a Republican Congress that, frankly, it's hard to imagine a lot of legislation getting to the president's desk when you've got split control. Maybe there's some chances there that you can talk about. But what should the primary role of Republicans in Congress be in this period where quickly we're going to talk about Democratic oversight, we're going to talk about Democratic attempts at legislation, and then we're going to talk about the presidential?
When you talk about Congress, you mean Congress and Senate?
Yeah, the Senate particularly, yeah.
Look, I think one of the things that the Democrats will find that the Republicans experienced is it's very hard to govern from the Congress. We had when President Obama was president, and Paul Ryan was and Speaker Boehner were speakers, it is very difficult to govern from the House. And you can do a lot of things, but you can be, being obstructionist really doesn't get you anywhere. And my hope is that with the new congressmen who are coming in and the new senators, one of whom I know very well and I know is open to working on both sides of the aisle and with the White House, that for the American people, and you bring up the issue. I mean, every American is very interested in health care. And it is incumbent upon the White House, the Senate, and Congress to address the needs of the American people. And so I go into it, and I think this is an opportunity for everyone to take a deep breath and say, okay, let's try to do this right. Whether that will happen or not, I hope it does. We have a lot of new members, and if everyone just does take stock of unless they work together, nothing's going to happen. And we've been in that gridlock position before. It's a bad place to be. So let's see what happens.
Maria Teresa Kumar, Beth mentions these new members. And one of the first images we saw of one member in particular, who's very high profile in this freshman class, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she popped up at freshman orientation actually at a protest outside Nancy Pelosi's office on the issue of climate change. What do you make of that? And do you think this class of newly elected members of Congress understands the difference between activism and leadership? Are you concerned that they're going to bring a different spirit that isn't a governing spirit to Washington?
Oh, no.
Looks like we've lost Maria's
No, there
audio.
we go.
Oh, unmuted. There we go.
You didn't hear me drink water. So basically, what I would say is that the constituency that brought them forth, whether it's Ocasio and others, was very much on an activist base. Let's not forget that she was part of the Bernie cohort. She worked for Bernie. And so I think that she's going to have to figure out how to needle both, basically thread the needle on both, on how to keep her constituency happy so she is considered authentic and a true leader, while at the same time learning how to put on a different hat of which is pure politicking and negotiating behind closed doors. And that is going to be something that I think for a lot of these folks is going to be difficult, but it also ensures that we have a type of different revolution when it comes to thinking outside the box when it comes to policymaking.
Michael Glassner, I want to turn to a point about the Trump rallies that we saw. And no president in recorded history has done as many rallies in a midterm as he has. They seem to double, to my mind, as 2020 organizing efforts. I'm sure you were hopeful for that as well, to get things started early. But what was your sense of the swath of the country that he came into contact with? Because it struck me that he was going to pretty safe places for him. Places that voted for him, and obviously they were friendly audiences. Did the president have a sense going into Election Day of what the country was voting on and who was voting in the country, given the way he had spent his last 10 days or so?
I don't think you can really differentiate between the day he announced that he was running until the Election Day of this year as far as what he does. Because the phenomenon that you mentioned is unprecedented, and the impact that it has on not on the culture, I would say, is also different than it has been previously. So, again, you can't use the old set of measurements to measure what this president has done and will do. One of the hardest things, I've been in this presidential campaigns for 30 years. This is my 6th one I'm on now. So, the hardest thing for me when I started there was to realize that everything I knew in my career experience before that, much of it didn't apply and wasn't relevant any longer. So once you get to that place, you can understand the Trump phenomenon a little more, I think, and be open to it. But in any case, the places where we went were where there were, in many cases, competitive House and Senate races. So that was, there were markets where he had done well and states where he had done well, but there was a strategy behind them that was, intended to help win House seats and Senate seats.
Mostly Senate, though, wasn't it?
It was both. We had a lot of House candidates that were featured at our events. So, the impact, the one thing that you don't really see from a high level if you're just watching these things on TV is that leading up to them, there's many, many, many days of free media leading up to the event. The event itself is in most cases, is broadcast live on national television and statewide or in the district that you're targeting. For several days afterwards, there's a huge impact of earned media at the local level. You don't really see that unless you're there in Billings, but in Billings, it was a huge thing that had an impact for weeks, this one event. And then the other thing that is not most, but extremely important about it is we collect tremendous amounts of data before, during, and after these things. Email addresses, text messages. We recruit volunteers. We had a large organization from the RNC working the line. The lines outside these things can be a mile long. We had people out there registering voters, identifying voters, providing voter information. So there's a tremendous amount of activity that goes on below the radar that you really can't see as watching on TV, that has a tremendous value to both the campaigns we are assisting and sharing that data, and then that we can aggregate for the re-election committee.
Stephanie, you look like you wanted to jump in a moment ago, but I want to get to you.
I was thinking about that rally in Billings, Montana, and thinking about how much energy it spurred in Missoula, Montana, as the Democrats got riled up. And that is a lot of the counter reaction to those rallies, is that, yes, you did get a lot of gains for the Republican base, but we also got a lot of gains out of that, particularly in these suburban and exurban House seats where we did so well across the country. And so it was fraught with some risk that must have been talked about a lot, I would imagine, as you go in, because we really did see increased enthusiasm. And one of the things that I'm so excited about this election cycle, and I will tell you, I am not seeing any of it slow down, and I believe it is going to continue right through 2020, is that our activist base, our small dollar donor base, the energy particularly driven by women and women activists and first-time women donors and first-time women activists, they are hungry for change and they are motivated. So every time he would do one of those rallies, we would see an increase of activism, particularly among women.
Beth, do you think the Republican Party has a problem with women?
Well, I don't think this year was a particularly good year for the Republican Party with women. And yes, I do, actually. I think it's something that, as a Republican woman, I think about all the time. And I believe in conservative principles. I believe that they are the best for the country. I believe they're the best for the individuals. And we have to figure out a way to tell every woman, white, brown, black, young, old, that they have a place in the Republican Party. I think that is a place that perhaps the Trump administration has not done as well as they could have done. And I'm sure that that's something you're working on. Yeah, kudos to the Democrats who organized the enthusiasm in the exurban and suburban women.
Is it something you're working on, Michael?
What's that? Oh, I think so. Yeah, and it's more it's the policies too that you have to pay attention to, right? It's easy to get distracted by the politics and the disruption that the rallies cause and the political activity around them. So I think that's why the president does extremely well with the Republican base right now, and all the polling I'm seeing very consistently high. And it's in reaction to the policies that if you sort of remove the hoopla of the political layer and look at the policies, much of what he's done is in line with traditional Republican values. In particular, the courts obviously have been covered widely, the judicial appointees that the administration has made, but the deregulatory state that also has been implemented under this president is also very significant. I think that ultimately it's the policies and the success or lack of success with them that are going to determine the outcome.
But don't you think also the words used matter too? I mean, I think a lot of the Republican women that I talk to, they want to vote for Republicans, but the rhetoric and the tone this year really turned them off, and I think that's something we have to work on.
I constantly heard the lack of civility coming out of a lot of focus groups, particularly of independent women. And Emily's list just came out of, or just got our data back from our series of polling over the nights of the election. We did 7,200 survey respondents. And what's interesting, I literally just got them as I was coming in, so I have to read them off my piece of paper. But it was stunning to me because the gender gap it grows. Now it grows both ways, right? More and more women are voting for Democrats, more and more men are voting for Republicans. So the gender gap in its entirety, we could both argue are not good things for the parties as we separate this out. But in 4 key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nevada, we saw women voters voting for our women senators in those states by 28 points. 63 to 35, and the men supporting the Republican only 42, well, Democrat was 42, 55 for the Republican, so 13 point. It's the language, it's also the policies. And I too, as someone who's committed to electing Democratic women, because we don't have 50% of our caucuses, so I'm not, we got a lot of work to do. But we know that when we see more and more women leaders, you inspire additional women leaders. And we just saw a historic gain of women in the US House. It's all on the Democratic side, and we're gonna see one of the lowest numbers of Republican women in the US House than we've seen almost since Emily's List started in 1985. And I think it's important to hear more women's voices coming through the leadership of the Republican Party, because I think it matters for inspiring next generations of women.
Maria, how much of this election, in your mind, was a reaction to Donald Trump? People activated, inspired to run, inspired to organize, inspired to vote by what they've seen in these last couple of years, versus a more general awakening? And how much of this moment has really been defined by the president and his leadership and the reactions that have created by it?
Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, I'm on the board of Emily's List, so I'm just going to borrow one of
same numbers.
In 2016, we had, what was it, Stephanie, it was roughly 600 women that decided that they were going to run for office. As of a couple of weeks ago, we had over 43,000 women saying that they were going to run for office. And the largest civil rights protest in our country's history happened the day after inauguration. And it didn't happen just in the coasts, but it happened in deep red states. And it happened in all 7 continents. So when you start saying what is the biggest factor, when you basically use the 2014 election as a baseline, 2014, the midterm, was the lowest participation rates for 70 years. Fast forward to this midterm, it was the highest in 100 years. When you look at the Latino vote is usually really very much suppressed when it comes to participation. This past midterm, we had presidential participation numbers. We were 11% of the electoral base. We had roughly 12.7 million Latinos that came out to vote, compared to 12.9 million during the 2016 election. Once registered, Latinos actually participate. They didn't participate in 2014, but they did participate this time, and they participated in places where technically it should have been completely red. There's no reason why Georgia, Florida, Texas was in play, or Arizona. But it was deeply seated and rooted in a backlash within the Latino community actually finally punching up. And the challenge is going to be is, are we going to be able to actually absorb the new number of young voters that are going to be coming in? As I shared before, we're expecting 12 million new young voters coming in by 2020. A quarter of them are going to be Hispanic. The median age of a white voter, of a white person in the United States, is 54. The median age of a Latino is 19 years old. So the Republican Party is going to have to reshift and reimagine how they look if they actually want to get a road to the White House.
I want to talk briefly about the 2020 potential field before we get to questions from the audience. So let's start with the Republican side. Michael, do you believe, as of today, a week and a half after the election, that Donald Trump will have a primary challenger?
I do not.
Beth? Good correct answer. Beth, Senator Jeff Flake said recently that he believes there should be a primary challenger. He hopes there will be. He wouldn't say whether that's going to be him. There's been noises about John Kasich, potentially, maybe Bob Corker, maybe even Mitt Romney. But do you believe there's going to be, and should there be, a primary challenger? Is that good for the party to have that fight?
To quote a great man, I do not. I have to give you some kudos since you are really the lone man on this stage.
Is that the answer to both, though?
Yeah.
That you don't think that there will be one and that there should not be one?
I don't think there will be one, and I think Look, there should always be an opportunity for in any democracy and republic for anyone who wants to challenge and run for higher office to do so. But I think it's not a reality. Look, it's December, or almost December. The first primaries are going to be in 13, 14 months. And there's not even a whisper in the Republican Party of a challenge to the president. So I think it's not a reality. And yes, there may be a whisper with people talking about it, but none of the action steps have been taken that have to be taken to make it happen. So I don't think it's a reality.
Let's turn to the Democrats on the stage. I was working with my team just this week to try to come up with our list of potential 2020 contenders. Literally 40 names plus.
We play that game at our office too.
Yeah. So beyond getting into who the favorites or front runners would be, because who knows? I think we don't know how it's going to break down. I want to ask specifically, how many women do you think are going to run? What kind of that's going to be a first in terms of having multiple women, credible women running.
I hope so.
And is this what we'd expect to be a kind of a brawl on the Democratic side that goes in this direction? Is that going to be good or bad for the party? Is it going to divide before you face Trump?
Well, first though, it seems clear to us that there would never be a primary to Trump on that side, because the Republican Party is completely aligned now with Donald Trump, and that's what we saw in this election, and it's really a solidification. And the Republican-based voters are clearly supportive in every polling you see. I mean, part of their problem now is the number of people who claim they're Republicans is shrinking, so they got to be a little careful. At some point, folks have got to start talking to independents. On the Democratic side, we have a lot of folks who are thinking about it. It will be interesting to see how many jump. I think I've always believed, and you've all done presidential campaigns. All of us have done presidents, sometimes against each other on different sides. We've been through some presidential primaries as well. I have always believed that the primary makes the person ready to be president, right? The process is so challenging to get through. Can you build a nationwide organization? Can you fund it? Can you capture the imagination of first your party, then the American people? And I think we have a lot of bright stars, including a number of women. I always bring up 4 who I hope are seriously considering. Whether they all run or they don't run, I don't know. But one of those, obviously, Senator Elizabeth Warren here in Massachusetts, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Senator Amy Klobuchar, and Senator Kamala Harris, my east to west there. And are there others out there? There may be. The fact that there are 4 who get talked about in a meaningful way is a significant change, even in our party, to see that many women in position of conversation. And it may just sound like a normal, well, of course that's what happens. No. I mean, when we were going into 2016, and I was working with Amy Dacey, and we were begging the press to mention one other female name other than Hillary Clinton. It'd be Hillary Clinton and then 12 men. Good men, and the fact that we're now in a place where you're looking at, sort of your top 10 include typically those 4 women. And I think that's just a wonderful place. I think we're all going to see our first woman president, all of us. I really do believe that. I do not know if it's going to happen in 2020 or 24 or 28, but it is coming in our lifetimes. We're going to see it. And then we're going to have to, through the party process, we're going to have an interesting debate, and we're going to have to see where things land, because there's a lot of good voices of both genders ready to go.
And Amy, it struck me watching this election unfold for Democrats that the debate that really split the party apart in 2016 didn't end with the 2018 results. You have a group of moderates, more rural Democrats who are saying we need to build on these successes. You have a series of progressive Democrats. It seems like everyone found something to like in this.
That's true.
Are you worried that the same splits that may have damaged Hillary Clinton going into the general election last time, the Bernie versus Hillary thing, is going to get replayed just with more players?
I think it's always a challenge, and it was a challenge for the Republicans in 2016 in their primary. When you have so many in the race. You know, the reality is there's not much space in between a lot of these candidates that are going to run, but in order to win and differentiate yourself, sometimes you have to create, you know, this larger space. I think what matters is how you come together after you have a nominee. I do think that there's a lot of candidates that are going to be running from different parts of, or you know, having different, you could say wings of the party, or, you know, and with having that robustness. But I think at the end of the day, even when you saw differences with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, the smart things that Senator Sanders wanted to make sure were in the party platform had always traditionally been there. I think it's the margins where some of the, you know, specifics on the policies are different. It's how we come together. Even in some of the primaries that you saw where young challengers went against the, you know, sitting long-term incumbents, like with a Joe Crowley or a Mike Capuano, it's what those candidates do after that primary and how they come together in the community. And so, you know, I think it's one of the things that I think about a lot is how you move forward. You know, also how long the primary process is going to be is a question too, because how much time it does get candidates ready, but then you've got, you know, especially if there's no challenge on the Republican side, it is challenging when they've had the ability to not have that kind of internal discussion. But I still think we can have a healthy debate, and it sounds like if there's any students in the audience, they should send their resume over to CNN, because they're going to have to hire a few extra people.
If people have questions you want to line up at the microphones here, we'll take that in a second. But before we get to that, just to button this up with you, Maria, on 2020, does it strike you as meaningful that that this diverse field of Democrats is likely to emerge? It could be. It's very possible, to the point that Stephanie made, that white men are a minority of the Democratic contenders. Even if there are 20 of them, you'll have people of color and women populating maybe half the podiums or more.
Well, I think we're seeing it with the incoming Congress, right? We're actually seeing a diverse slate of individuals that reflect more of the country, and that is part of the enthusiasm. For the very first time, we had roughly over 600 millennials running for office, all the way from the schoolhouse all the way to Congress and to the Senate. We've never seen that before, and that slate is what is going to energize the base in many ways. So I think that the more that the Democratic Party can embrace not just diversity in what individuals look like, but also diversity in modernizing a lot of policies, that's what's going to get people very excited. But in order for them to win the imaginations of these voters that basically voted for the very first time, to keep them engaged, for the next 2 years, the Democrats are going to have to be able to differentiate what makes them so different from the Trump agenda.
Okay, thank you for that. So let's take some time for questions now. If people want to line up at the microphones, I'd ask that you just tell us who you are and try to keep the question a little bit discreet so we can get to as many as possible, and make it, you know, ended with a question mark as opposed to a statement. But we'll do a little bit of both. But yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this event. Very fascinating. My name is Meredith Siegel. I'm a recent HKS 2017 alum and a member of the alumni board here. I was very interested in Mr. Glassner's comment, which I agree with, that in 2016, the pollsters were asking the wrong questions of the wrong people. So I wonder for you, and perhaps for others as well, imagine it's now August 2020. The conventions have ended. What two questions do you think would most strongly predict the outcome of the election?
Dan and I will take notes for our ABC Post poll. This is a good one. What do you think, Michael? What were you looking at, or what would you look at?
What would be?
Yeah.
I think we would look. I think we would look at virtually the same demographic as we did before, which is low propensity voters and highly motivated Trump voters. That was sort of the combination that we used to win in the primaries, and that was how I think that'll continue to be the case next time. That's sort of been what has formulated that base. I mean, it was very frustrating, I think, for the other primary candidates in 2015 and 16, that he was able to immediately solidify this base of 30 or 40% of the Republicans that never left. All the way through, you know, that entire process, we had 17 debates. You know, it was long and challenging for all the campaigns and expensive, but that base never really went away. So, and then, you know, we were able to build on that, obviously, in the general election enough to win. So I think it'll be fairly similar to that.
Is there an issue set election, or like an issue question that you think is indicative beyond the propensity to vote?
That's a question you could ask in a typical election cycle with typical politicians, but we don't have that in this case. And it's also too much time, to, as Beth pointed out, between now and then, that I wouldn't begin to predict that. It's also highly relevant to who the Democrat nominee is. It's obviously impossible to know.
Yes, sir.
My name is Ryan Davis, and I'm a senior at the college. My question is about young voters. I'm curious if you had any new realizations from the midterms about what you know about young voters, considering there was record high turnout this year. Is this a cultural change in the way that young people get civically involved, or is this a byproduct of the current political environment?
Anyone have thoughts?
I certainly hope that it is the beginning of a culture change, and I believe that's exactly what it is. We have seen such an awakening by a number, and Maria Teresa can speak to this too, by a number of demographics in our country. But the energy of young voters coming in, still like to see it higher. I mean, the millennial generation is bigger than the baby boomers. You're all of voting age. Guess who gets to control the election in 2020 if the vote turnout is high? Like, this is it, right? And I think that what is driving the concerns of not only your generation, but I'm probably one and a half generations older than you, my generation, is opportunity, is healthcare, is education, and future. Like, are we gonna have a good future? Who are we gonna be as a country? And I think that energy is gonna be really, really important. I also think the candidates matter. And we had this election cycle, as you just heard, over 600 millennials run for office. We just elected 2 young women under the age of 30 for the first time in the United States House of Representatives. Very different, and from very different places in the country. But I think seeing that you are part of the leadership, in that there are role models of your age, is really important. And I think that's going to spur a whole nother generation. I'm hoping we have a lot of seats we need to recruit for right now. So I'm hoping that a lot of young folks decide to run in 2020.
Maria, what do you think?
So I would just footnote too that for the very first time, we saw serious strategic investment in the youth vote. So it wasn't just an aspirational will they turn out. For the very first time, you had roughly about $100 million going into group movements that we've never seen before. March for Our Lives, in many ways, was also a game changer. They just them alone basically were able to raise close to $30 million. Tom Steyer from California poured in another $30 million on college campuses. We've just never seen this level. So it's this, not only were they able to actually see a supply of individuals on the marketplace, but they actually met the demand by actually creating an infrastructure. And that is a model that we can actually go ahead and start using in other communities that are less enfranchised. And I'm thinking of the South Asian community, I'm thinking of the Latino community, and the African American communities. You can't just have an aspiration of will they come, you actually have to build that infrastructure. And that is something that the Progressive Party and the Republican Party really have to sort out, if that is something that they really genuinely believe in this demographic.
But Rick, can I just add to that real quick? Because, hi, how are you? It's really important, though, that we're asking young people to vote and help them understand what connects the personal with the political, but we have to make sure that our registration, voting systems, how we vote, when we can vote, the access to voting has to be changed, because we have to invest more time and energy to make sure that we're making sure that it's more accessible and there aren't barriers that are doing that. And I think that's on us to make sure that happens. There was problems, I know, and challenges just being on campus this semester with absentee voting and how do you get the ballots, and we just have to work. And we've got a system that it's individual and very different from state to state. It can cause confusion. We have to make sure that we're improving that constantly, so that not only are we asking young people to vote and asking new people to vote, but giving them a process that's user-friendly and easy and helps them to become a part of the process.
And to that point, one of the things that changed, and I see it in my own kids, is early voting.
Yeah.
And that's a great thing. It makes it easier. It makes it and I think that's going to be, when we look at this year's voting, I suspect that we'll see one of the reasons that turnout increased so much is that there was a whole lot more early voting. But I want to talk also about young people and the Republican vote. And I think one of the things that we're going to see, and I'm hopeful, is that the economy and jobs continue to improve. And if that's the case, I think the Republicans are going to make a very strong case to the young people of America that we are the party of opportunity, and that is something that's incumbent upon us to do.
Yes, up there.
Hi, my name is Damien. I'm a junior at the college. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. My question is about gender in the 2020 race and the Democratic strategy as we look forward to that. It would make sense to me as we see a lot of the Democratic energy channeled in the midterms by women of color that we would have someone like Kamala Harris at the top of a 2020 ticket. But when we think about the strategy for 2020, do we see the same success of women of color against incumbent white men? Do we see that happening on a national level as well, or is that something we can really only see district by district?
So what we have right now is just a growing pipeline of very, very talented, strong women of color candidates from all backgrounds, African American, Latina, Asian American. It's really extraordinary and very, very exciting. And I think you're going to see every election for the rest of your life. We are going to see more and more people of color, and particularly women of color, who are in positions to run. And I think we're going to. I have no doubts we're going to see an increase of women of color running in 2020. I'd sure like to see a woman of color on that ticket. I think it would be phenomenal. But we really just need to keep on urging women to run. And the one thing I want to say, we're all talking about how exciting this moment is because there's so many women who ran and won. There still weren't nearly as many women running as men. We still are not at the numbers across the country elected nor candidates. It is still a little bit more challenging for women candidates to step up and run. I just had a conversation with an incoming member of Congress she is tired of answering the question, who's going to take care of your kids when you enter Congress? And that is a daily question for these young women with young children. Gretchen Whitmer, Governor-elect Whitmer, would get asked on the campaign trail, are you going to run as a woman? It's just a really odd question, but I know we know there's things behind that question. And so we're still not there yet, which is why it's even more important that we continue to build the infrastructure to get there, the support around those candidates, and ensuring that they're getting what they need, good staff to support all of those candidates, because this does take a huge operation to do. None of these races just happen. You build a machine to do this work, and as Maria Teresa was just saying, it's investments that matter, and it's across the board.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Lyle. I'm a sophomore at the college. I also have a question kind of about the Democratic possible nominee in 2020. But mine is more about kind of the place on the political spectrum. So do you believe that a more moderate candidate from the Democratic side, one that might be able to swing Republicans or independents over into kind of the Democratic vote, or is going to be more strategic for the Democrats in 2020, or a kind of more a candidate that's farther to the left that might be able to energize like a larger base?
Maybe Michael should answer that first. Who would you rather run against? I mean,
what's that?
Who would you rather run against? A moderate or a progressive?
Just whisper it to me.
I think that I think generally speaking, my own personal opinion is that probably the more progressive candidate will be the nominee. That would be my guess. And I would also say that would be my preference too, as an opponent.
Why?
I think that it's more polarizing for the voting public, probably, right? You would have a very clear differentiation between the candidates, and I think that works to the incumbent's advantage. I also think that it would give you, theoretically, you would have a greater chance of gaining support from independents or unaffiliated in the general election if the Democrat nominee were more leftist.
What do you think, Maria? Where do the Democrats land? Are they more to the left or more to the center?
So first of all, I think that they have to come up with policies that basically are modernized. And I think when we were talking about how a lot of the low propensity voters went for Trump, it was because they would have gone for Bernie just as easily, if we're honest. And so they're basically looking for some radical change. That said, I always like to use the example of Marion Barry, the former wild mayor of Washington, D.C., where basically everybody was going bananas, and they finally said, you know what, we kind of just want to settle down and tone it down. And then all of a sudden, Anthony Williams came on next, and he was an accountant with a bow tie. And I would encourage that that's kind of what the country is looking for, and that's one of the reasons why so many suburban folks from the suburbs went and voted for the Democrat. They kind of want people to put their heads down and do their job, and I believe that that's what they're going to look for in a candidate as well on the Democratic side.
So we've got two more questions, two more people standing up, and I think we'll have time for both, so go ahead.
I'm Russell Citra, and I'm a student at the business school. So my question is about the impact of the midterms on the outcome of 2020. So I think it's sort of easy to jump to the conclusion, like Democrats won the House, therefore, that's a win for the Democrats. But I think so much of, the presidential election is around storytelling, and I wonder whether that creates a sort of easy angle for the president, regardless of where the country's at. So if the country's in a great spot, he can sort of say, we're doing great. And if the country's in a not great spot, he can sort of say, well, it wasn't a great spot, but then the Democrats won the House, and now that's why it's not. So I'm wondering whether you think the midterm outcome was truly like a positive win for the Democrats, or whether there is sort of that long-term spin on it.
Well, I definitely think that the Democratic win of this election cycle is a huge positive. Do I think that the fact that the Democrats took the majority in the House completely determines what's going to happen in 2020? No. If it did, Barack Obama would not have won his re-election, right? So this is just how this goes. What I am most excited about what has happened is a energy that I have not seen in a very long time on the Democratic side. An energy that has resulted in historic amounts of grassroots fundraising. We had House candidates that in the third quarter raised $3.8 million. When I started my first House candidate, their entire budget was $600,000. Okay, that was a long time ago, to be fair, but 3.8, that's unheard of. That is unheard of. And it was in small dollar donors. That is not going away. So we're going to have a great energy in small dollar donors. We have got this really fabulous built network that is expanding, that is the Latina community, the African American community, and women, particularly women in suburban and exurban areas, that after the Women's March, which really was just the march, because so many women and men marched in 2017, they just kept marching, and they went home and they started organizing, and they started pulling together these groups, and Indivisible popped up, and the women's huddles popped up, and Swing Left, and I mean the list goes on and on. There is an infrastructure that just was not as strong until this election. It's not going away. So that is the benefit of 2018 for the Democrats. We are now standing upon an infrastructure that was built very quickly. It's a little rocky in places, and we got to do some work, particularly as we go back into Ohio and back into Florida. But the seeds have been planted for it. And that is what makes 2020 for the Democrats such an opportunity, because we think we're going to attract, as we did this last election, our low propensity voters and independents to come our way.
I have a slightly different view. I hope
so.
Yeah, I got to get my years right. In 2010, I think the Republicans won 63 seats, and there was a ton of energy then, and it didn't translate necessarily in 2012. You are precisely right about the narrative, and the president. While midterm elections are much more about tactics, presidential elections are all about storytelling and narratives. And one of the things that has amazed me about President Trump, and I did not support him in the primary, but I got to give the guy an enormous amount of credit. The message that he had coming down the escalator at Trump Tower was the exact same message that he has today. He knows how to deliver a message, he knows how to tell a story, and he will, by the way, use the Democrat House as his foil. And he will use it, in my view, to great success in his narrative for the 2020 election. Michael knows that more than I do, but if I were in his shoes, that's what I would do. So I think that while there is a ton of energy on the Democrat side, we saw that same thing in the Republican side, and in 2010, and it does not necessarily translate into electoral success in the next presidential race.
Is Beth right? Does Donald Trump run against Nancy Pelosi, regardless of whoever?
Absolutely. I agree with basically everything she said about that, about the lack of continuation of the momentum last time we saw this, and about the president's ability to use the House as his foil. As she said, I really think that's exactly what's going to happen. And his messaging, which has been consistent throughout, and I don't anticipate that's going to change at all.
The one difference, though, if I may, is his strength, Donald Trump's strength, is to control message every day, which means he's delivering the kinds of things that are going to keep our energy up. Whereas President Obama, that's just not how he functioned. And so that makes this, to me, sort of a really interesting time, because he does control the narrative, but that narrative is very motivating to our side, and that's not going to go away.
Barack Obama was very motivating to our side also.
Right. Well, to your point, it has the opposite effect.
But he wasn't daily in the news like this, or hourly.
Well, you talked about the negative backslash from the rallies, right, for the Republicans, and I think this same is true in this case, in that his rhetoric energizes the Republicans too.
Yeah. Our last question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kezia, and I'm a junior at the college. And given that so many of you are in campaign finance, it's a simple question. Is it possible that we're putting too much money into campaigns and not enough into the stuff that matters?
Maria, you want to get in on this?
So yes, and I think that one of the things that would, if the Democrats were truly interested in doing campaign finance reform, they should encourage the freshman class and the incoming House to basically pledge to basically get that out. If you care about basically gutting the NRA's power, or gutting any folks' power, that's one way to do it. But I think that one of the pieces that we have to keep in mind, and the difference between the DNC and the RNC running in, is that the president has a party and an infrastructure that is lockstep with him. The way that the Democratic Party now is functioning, it's increasingly decentralized, where the power is now in these satellite groups that are in some ways more left than some of the voters. And so the challenge for the party for running that presidential candidate is like, how are you going to bring in some of these more left groups under a fold under a candidate that may not be as left as they are, because the party is so decentralized right now?
So talking to Republican strategists down the stretch, they felt like they were getting swamped with ads. Democratic spending advantage this time made a huge difference.
Well, I think one of the tremendous advantages the Democrats have is the Act Blue platform, right, which the Republicans really don't have a counter to that. And that's going to be a major challenge for the Republicans in the next cycle. I mean, we raised over $100 million completely through small donors in the past 2 years, but the Act Blue platform did multiples of that, and will continue to, I presume, and that's a major challenge for the Republicans.
I just want to add, thank you for asking that question, Kezia. I think it's not just about the volume of money, it's who, to Maria Teresa's, Kumar's point, it's like who's spending it, and it's time to give candidates back the power in their own campaigns. And that's what I worry about the most, is this outside spending is not at their discretion. And sometimes it doesn't matter what side it's coming from, in support of them or against them. It's not always the messaging that they want out or represents truly. And I think in some respects they're, if it's going to exist, at least be transparent, and we have to disclose donors, and we have to say how they're spending it, because that's a big disadvantage for candidates, political parties, candidate committees, is that they have to be the most transparent people in this process, and every month tell people how they're spending it and how they're getting it. And so I think we have a lot to do to overturn Citizens United and make those changes.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for this conversation.
Thanks.
It was civil and illuminating, so thank you. Thank you to Maria for joining us on Skype. Thank you, Stephanie, for jumping in straight from the airport. We appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
She's like, time to go back.
Well, sorry,
Really is.
you ahead of time.
I wonder if the IOP pays for it.
It's such a pleasure to be on with you.
Yeah, I'm sure that said I'd probably get these people to come.
Thank you so much.